Now we start with the Mediterranean Ocean, the Nile River, the Tigris, and the Euphrates. So the great civilizations of ancient Egypt, Mesopotamia, and the area we refer to as the Fertile Crescent, of which a little part here about the size of Rhode Island is Canaan, or Canaan. And archaeologists in the 19th and 20th centuries were stunned to find the ruins and the records of remarkable peoples and cultures, massive, complex empires in some cases, but some of which had completely disappeared from human memory. Their newly uncovered languages had been long forgotten. Their rich literary and legal texts were now undecipherable. That soon changed. But because of those discoveries, we are now in a position to appreciate the monumental achievements of these early civilizations, these earliest civilizations. The archaeological discoveries that are referred to in the ancient Near East revealed to us the spiritual and cultural heritage of all of the inhabitants of the region, including the Israelites. And one of the major consequences of these finds is the light that they have shed on the background and the origin of the materials in the Bible. So we now see that the traditions in the Bible did not come out of a vacuum. The early chapters of Genesis, Genesis 1 through 11, they're known as the primeval history, which is a very unfortunate name because these chapters really are not best read or understood as history in the conventional sense. But these 11 chapters owe a great deal to ancient Near Eastern mythology. The creation story in Genesis 1 draws upon the Babylonian epic known as Enuma Elish. We'll be talking about that text in some depth. The story of the first human pair in the Garden of Eden, which is in Genesis 2 and 3, has clear affinities with the Epic of Gilgamesh. That's a Babylonian and Assyrian epic in which a hero embarks on this exhausting search for immortality. The story of Noah and the flood, which occurs in Genesis 6 through 9, is simply an Israelite version of an older flood story that we have found copies of, a Mesopotamian story called the Epic of Atrahasis, a flood story that we also have incorporated in the Epic of Gilgamesh. Biblical traditions have roots that stretch deep into earlier times and out into surrounding lands and traditions. And the parallels between the biblical stories and ancient Near Eastern stories that they parallel has been the subject of intense study. However, it isn't just the similarity between the biblical materials and the ancient Near Eastern sources that is important to us. In fact, in some ways, it's the dissimilarity that is remarkably important to us. The biblical transformation of a common Near Eastern heritage in light of its radically new conceptions of God and the world and humankind. I'll give you one quick example. We have a Sumerian story from about the 3rd millennium BCE, right? Going back 3,000 BCE. It's a story of Ziusudra, and it's very similar to the Genesis flood story of Noah. In both of these stories, the Sumerian and the Israelite story, you have a flood that is the result of a deliberate divine decision. One individual is chosen to be rescued. That individual is given very specific instructions on building a boat. He's given instructions about who to bring on board. The flood comes and exterminates all living things. The boat comes to rest on a mountaintop. The hero sends out birds to reconnoiter the land. When he comes out of the ark, he offers a sacrifice to the god. The same narrative elements are in these two stories. It's just wonderful when you read them side by side. So what is of great significance, though, is not simply that the biblical writer is retelling a story that was clearly went around everywhere in the ancient Mesopotamia. They were transforming the story so that it became a vehicle for the expression of their own values and their own views. In the Mesopotamian stories, for example, the gods act capriciously. The gods act on a whim. In fact, in one of the stories, the gods say, "Oh, people, they're so noisy, I can't sleep. Let's wipe them all out." Right? That's the rationale. There's no moral scruple. They destroy these helpless but stoic humans who are chafing under their tyrannical and unjust and uncaring rule. In the biblical story, when the Israelites told the story, they modified it. It's God's uncompromising ethical standards that lead him to bring the flood in an act of divine justice. He's punishing the evil corruption of human beings that he has so lovingly created and whose degradation he can't bear to witness. So it's saying something different. It's providing a very different message. So when we compare the Bible with the literature of the ancient Near East, we'll see not only the incredible cultural and literary heritage that was obviously common to them. But we'll see the ideological gulf that separated them, and we'll see how biblical writers so beautifully and cleverly manipulated and used these stories, as I said, as a vehicle for the expression of a radically new idea. Those who were responsible for the final editing, the final forms of the texts, had a decidedly monotheistic perspective, ethical monotheistic perspective. And they attempted to impose that perspective on their older source materials. And for the most part, they were successful, but at times the result of their effort is a deeply conflicted, deeply ambiguous text. Most of our cherished presuppositions about the Bible are based on astonishing claims that others have made on behalf of the Bible, claims that the Bible has not made on behalf of itself. The first is the idea that the Bible's a book. It's not a book. We'll get rid of that one. Okay, the Bible is not a book, with all that that implies, that it has a uniform style and a message and a single author, the sorts of things we think of when we think in a conventional sense of the word book. It's a library, right? It's an anthology of writings or books written and edited over an extensive period of time by people in very different situations, responding to very different issues and stimuli, some political, some historical, some philosophical, some religious, some moral. There are many types or genres of material in the Bible. There's narratives, wonderful narrative stories. There's all kinds of law. There are cultic and ritual texts that prescribe how some ceremony is supposed to be performed. There are records of the messages of prophets. There's lyric poetry. There's love poetry. There are proverbs. There are psalms of thanksgiving and lament. So there's a tremendous variety of material in this library. And that leads me to my second point, which is that biblical narratives are not pious parables about saints. Okay? Not pious tales. They're psychologically real literature about very real and realistic people and life situations. They're not stories about pious people whose actions are always exemplary and whose lives should be models for our own, despite what Sunday school curricula will often turn them into, right? And despite what they would have us believe. The Bible abounds with human, not superhuman beings, and their behavior can be scandalous. It can be violent, it can be rebellious, outrageous, lewd, vicious, but at the same time, like real people, they can turn around and act in a way that is loyal and true, above and beyond the call of duty. They can change, they can grow. Thirdly, the Bible's not for children. I have a 12-year-old and 8-year-old, I won't let them read it. I won't let it read it. Those Bible stories for children books, they scare me. They really scare me. It's not suitable for children. The subject matter in the Bible is very adult, particularly the narrative texts. There are episodes of treachery and incest and murder and rape, and the Bible is not for naive optimists. It's not for children in another sense. Like any literary masterpiece, the Bible is characterized by a sophistication of structure and style and an artistry of theme and metaphor. And believe me, that's lost on adult readers quite often. It makes its readers work. The Bible doesn't moralize, or rarely moralizes. It explores moral issues and situations, puts people in moral issues and situations. The conclusions have to be drawn by the reader. The fourth myth we want to get rid of. The Bible is not a book of theology. It's not a catechism or a book of systematic theology. It's not a manual of religion, despite the fact that at a much later time, very complex systems of theology are going to be spun from particular interpretations of biblical passages. You know, there's nothing in the Bible that really corresponds to prevailing modern Western notions of religion, what we call religion. And indeed, there's no word for religion in the language of biblical Hebrew. There just isn't a word religion. It's clear that in biblical times and in the ancient Near East generally, religion wasn't a set of doctrines that you ascribed to. All right? To become an Israelite, you simply joined the Israelite community. You lived in Israelite life. You died in Israelite death. You obeyed Israelite law and custom. You revered Israelite lore. You entered into the historical community of Israel by accepting that their fate and yours should be the same. It was sort of a process of naturalization, what we think of today as naturalization. So the Hebrew Bible just isn't a theological textbook. It contains a lot of narratives, and its narrative materials are an account of the odyssey of a people. the nation of Israel. They're not an account of the divine, which is what theology means, an account of the divine. Finally, on our myth count, I would point out, well, I don't really need to cross this out. This is something to discuss. I would point out that the Bible was formulated and assembled and edited and modified and censored and transmitted, first orally and then in writing, by human beings. The Bible itself doesn't claim to have been written by God. That belief is a religious doctrine of a much later age, and even then one wonders how literally it was meant. It's interesting to go back and look at some of the earliest claims about the origin of the biblical text. Similarly, the so-called 5 books of Moses, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, the first 5 books we call the Pentateuch of Moses, nowhere claim to have been written in their entirety by Moses. That's not something they say themselves. Some laws in Exodus, the Book of the Covenant, a few things, yes, it says Moses wrote those down, but not the whole 5 books that traditions later will ascribe to him. The Bible clearly had many contributors over many centuries, and the individual styles and concerns of those writers, their political and religious motivations, betray themselves frequently. So the Bible is this assemblage of books and writings dating from approximately 1000 BCE down to the 2nd century. The last book within the Hebrew Bible was written in the 160s BCE. We don't, of course, have any original copies of these materials as they came off the pen of whoever it was who was writing them. And in fact, before the middle of the 20th century, our oldest manuscripts, fragments and manuscripts of the Bible dated to the year 900. That's an awful long distance, right, from the events they're talking about. And what was so exciting in the middle of the 20th century was the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. I'm sure that you've heard of them. They brought about a dramatic change in the state of our knowledge of the Hebrew our Hebrew manuscript evidence. The Dead Sea Scrolls were found in caves in the Judean desert, and among them we have found an almost complete copy of the book of Isaiah, and then partial or copies or fragments of all of the biblical books, except maybe Esther. Am I wrong about that? I don't think there's an Esther from Qumran. I think that's the only one. And some of them date back to the 4th and 3rd century. So do you understand now why everybody was so excited? Suddenly we have evidence 13 or 1400 years earlier that people were reading this stuff, and by and large it's a pretty constant textual tradition. Sure, there are differences. We see that our manuscripts are not exactly like those fragments, but there is a remarkable degree, a high degree of correspondence, so that we really can speak of a relatively stable textual tradition, but still some fluidity.